Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever the heck you are, whatever you're doing, I'm glad you're here. Hey, I'm wondering, have you ever wanted to ethically influence people? Not manipulation, but actually ethically influence people? Well, today we are in for a treat. Today we get to have a chat with Brian Ahearn. He's the author of the new book, which is fantastic, by the way, Influence People. And people is an acronym for powerful everyday opportunities to persuade that are lasting and ethical, which I really, really love. And this is a great book. I got recommended to it by a past guest from Dory Clark, and it is dynamite. So super excited that Brian's here. If you want to know about Brian, he is brilliant. He's one of only 20 people in the world who is a Cialdini certified influence expert, which is really, really cool. Dr. Cialdini, his work and influence is fantastic, and Brian's is awesome as well. He facilitates a 2-day Principles of Persuasion workshop, and he's one of only a handful that get to lead the Cialdini Moment Maker workshop. So what I love about Brian, though, is he says his why is helping people enjoy more professional success and personal happiness, which comes as a result of excellent training with consistent coaching. That's how he accomplished that, which is my philosophy as well. And I'm just delighted that he's here with us today. How's it going, Brian?
It's going great. It is a beautiful day in Columbus, Ohio. I told somebody it's a little slice of heaven for the other 10 months that aren't as nice. So we've got September and October are awesome in Ohio.
That's awesome. Well, I'm originally from Wisconsin, so I totally can relate to that. I understand. We get 2 months in Wisconsin, too. The problem is, though, they're not consecutive. It's 3 days here and 6 there, but that happens. So that's
Yep.
Cool, man. So, hey, first, I got to ask you, how did you get started studying influence, and why was it important to you when you did?
Well, I will try to be brief in this, but it's a pretty interesting story. I had been involved in sales training for a number of years, and somebody who had formerly worked in the department of the insurance company I was with came down and gave a video to my boss and I and said, I think you guys will like this. And we watched it. It was Robert Cialdini presenting at Stanford. And right away, the light bulb came on. I thought, holy cow, this is all the psychology that underlies the sales training. It's why the techniques that we teach, why they work. And so I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by the fact that it was based on empirical data, wasn't somebody's good advice. I could, with confidence, go out and talk about this. And I really appreciated his stance on ethics. And he was talking about non-manipulative ways to get people to do things. I started using the video in some of the training. I'd just bring it to different offices, show it. We'd talk about the concepts. But what really got me into this then was signing up for Stanford's marketing. And sometime later, I got a marketing flyer, and it had bold letters at the top. It said bestseller. Right underneath it in bold letters, it said, call it influence, persuasion, or even manipulation, right in the headline. And I thought, wow, I cannot believe they would actually use that word. He's so clear about non-manipulative ways. So this ethical part of me felt like it needed to be addressed, and I emailed Stanford. And I basically said this: I don't know anybody who wants to be manipulated, and I don't know anybody who wants to be known as a good manipulator. That word cannot be helping sales, but it really could be hurting. Never heard from Stanford, but sometime later my phone rang at work. It was Robert Cialdini's office calling to personally thank me for having sent the email because Stanford changed the marketing of their video. And it was during the course of that conversation that we had him come to Columbus, Ohio, speak to the insurance agents, and the rest is history. But I've often thought, Phil, that if I hadn't felt that strong about the ethics of this, I never would have sent the email. I never would have got the call. The whole trajectory of my career, and I will say life, would be very, very different.
Wow. So one bold choice, one strong belief, one ethical dilemma, if you will, and
Yep.
it changed the entire trajectory of your life. So is that really how powerful influence can be, though? I mean, that sounds like that influence that you had on Cialdini certainly influenced him, but that certainly has influenced you as well.
Oh, absolutely. Because it's like a snowball going downhill after that. I mean, I was well, when I first got to meet Robert Cialdini, he had come to Columbus. He did some speaking. I went to Arizona, went through his workshop, and he was gracious enough to have my boss and I go to dinner with him. And I could tell by everything, the look on his face, the light in his eye, his smile, as he asked the question, how are you guys using what I teach? And we began to talk about it. He leaned in. He was so into how we were using his material to try to better the results of the company that I worked for. And I just remember thinking, that's somebody I want to be associated with. So yeah, there was influence swirling all around that.
Awesome. Well, let's get started here. Let's define influence though, Brian, because there's a lot of different ways that people define influence, right? Influencers or to be influenced. So can you define what you mean in the book, influence people? What exactly are you talking about, please?
Well, I always say influence is all about people because we can't persuade things. And I use this example a lot. I say it doesn't matter how good I am at persuasion. I can't come home and talk to my lawnmower and get it to start on a hot summer day. But I have had success talking to my wife or daughter to get them to start the lawnmower and cut the grass because I can influence people. And then when I talk about what it means to persuade, this is where I differ from some people. Persuasion, I think, is more than changing hearts and minds. It's about ultimately changing behavior. Because even if someone's heart or mind is changed, that doesn't necessarily mean their actions are going to change. And when you want someone to do something, it's not enough for them to say, that's a good idea. You want them to say, and I will do what you're asking. It could be your kids doing their homework. It could be their chores. It could be somebody at work. It's not enough to think that's a good idea. And so my default for this is Aristotle's definition of persuasion, which he says is the art of getting someone to do something that they wouldn't ordinarily do if you didn't ask. I think that's the best definition I have come across in the nearly 20 years I've been studying this in depth.
Wow. So would you say that sales is the same way, or is sales something different, Brian?
Well, I do differentiate persuasion from selling. Now, I will say that the core selling is all about persuading and moving people to action. But selling is only a subset of persuasion because there's a lot of things where people will use the term, well, we're always selling. Really, I say we're always persuading because I do look at a sale as ultimately where money is transacted. And there's a lot of people who will rebel against sales because salespeople don't always have the most positive reputation. And when you tell, for example, your employee base, everybody sells, there might be a lot of people who go, no, not me. I don't want to be a salesperson. But I think most people recognize every day, all day long, we are trying to influence other people to get our needs met, to get work done, and all types of other things.
Interesting. So persuasion's at the heart of that. Sales is a small subset of that. We all persuade. We don't necessarily all sell. Okay, I can absolutely buy that. Well, there's 7 components that you mentioned, 7 different ways that we influence and persuade. You talk about reciprocity, liking, unity, consensus, authority, consistency, and scarcity. Are those in order, or what's the philosophy behind those, Brian?
Well, some of the philosophy is when you are trying to move somebody to action, we need to think about what is most important. For example, early in a sale, it's going to be building a relationship. So and maybe it won't be a relationship, maybe it's going to just be rapport because you might only have a one and done deal depending on what you're selling. So tapping into something like liking, obviously, that if somebody likes you, they're more likely to buy. If you are helpful, if you do something for someone, engage some reciprocity, they're more likely to maybe do something for you in return. And that principle of unity that Robert Cialdini introduced in the book Persuasion goes much deeper than just liking. It's about a shared identity. And the best example that I can give you on a shared identity would be the example of my father who served in the Marines during the Vietnam War. When my dad meets another Marine, particularly one who's been in combat, I would swear that he is closer to that person than me, his own flesh and blood, because they have an identity. They've experienced something that very, very few other people can understand. So by tapping into any of those 3, you really can start to build at a minimum rapport, or if it's longer term, maybe a relationship with somebody. And the more they like you, the easier it is for them to ultimately say yes. So that was kind of the logic of putting those 3 at the beginning. Next, when it comes to selling, is overcoming uncertainty or objections. That's the term that we use typically in sales. And when somebody is potentially objecting, if you can tap into that principle of authority, which is all about expertise, people believe experts more, or you can tap into consensus. What are other people, especially people like you, what are they doing? That tends to reduce some of the uncertainty, some of the objections, and make it easier to move to the final stage in selling, which is closing. And typically, two principles that are very good there are principle of consistency. People feel this internal psychological pressure to be consistent in word and deed, and also scarcity, that fear of, well, what will I lose if I don't take this action? So those two are especially good at helping people close the sale. And so that was kind of the logic of the flow.
Cool. So let's talk about the last one first, and then we'll go through a couple examples here. And that is the whole scarcity, the what will I lose? And that was one of the things that I really was fascinated by in your book. You talked about how people are motivated more by what they might lose, by what they might gain. And now, does that go along with the whole idea of, we sell painkillers versus we sell vitamins, or is that a totally different topic, Brian?
I can see the analogy there. People will work harder to feel good than they probably will to feel excellent, right? When we're in pain, we will do what we can to relieve that pain. When we're not in pain, we may not feel so motivated to move to the next level and lose 15 pounds or something like that. But when it comes to the principle of scarcity, social psychologists believe that over the course of evolution, people who are more sensitive to what they may lose as opposed to what they may gain would have had a better chance to survive. Having an abundance would be wonderful, but not having enough, that could be the difference between life and death. And those who were more sensitive there were the ones who tended to survive. And there's no gene to point to, but it is empirical data to say that human beings feel the pain of loss anywhere from 2 to 2.5 times more than the joy of gaining the same thing. Dini won a Nobel Prize for his work with Amos Tversky in that area. Okay.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's go a little deeper into the whole idea of sales influence, because I think, that's one that I know a lot of people are interested in the audience here that are talking about that. So where you talk about dress does matter. Mm-hmm. And so often we see that the trend is towards more business casual. And like for me, I wear a dress shirt and a pair of dress pants 4 out of 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. I want to dress like a VP. I want to dress like, like I have, I guess, some authority. So what's the psychology behind the whole dressing for that?
Well, studies show that we tend to ascribe to people authority when we don't have really anything else to go on. What are some cues that are going to help us think that person might be somebody in charge? They might be somebody who knows what they're talking about. And something as simple as dress, that does convey that. If two people are saying the very same thing, and one person's maybe wearing a nice suit and the other person's wearing flip-flops and shorts, you're going to have more people believing the guy in the suit. You might say there's no rationale, and the truth might be that the guy in flip-flops and shorts might be every bit as knowledgeable, but we have been conditioned to understand that usually people who are dressed a certain way are those who are in authority. That's also why a policeman walking down the street telling you to do something might get you to do it right away. And that same person not wearing a uniform might elicit a look like, who the heck are you to tell me what to do?
That makes a lot of sense. So what about psychology for ourselves, right? Psychologically, does it matter if I'm if I'm an inside sales rep and I'm on the phone, or I'm a sales development rep and I'm on the phone, right? Much like you were in insurance, and you're not out, pounding the pavement. You're not out, on your shoes, right, knocking on doors. Is there a difference, or it doesn't even matter how we dress?
I think it does. The company I worked for before I left had gone to a no dress code policy. And when I say no dress code, literally a young guy, I'd seen guys come in flip-flops, basketball shorts, and tank tops. And we were located in downtown Columbus, capital of Ohio, a large insurance company headquartered. So it was like, holy cow. And that was always, just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Because how we dress also impacts how we think and feel about ourselves. And what I have noticed since we've moved to definitely in business, more casual than when I first started, which was always suit and tie or sports coat and tie. When I do put a suit on now, I really feel like it's game day. It reminds me of when I was in high school and I played football, and putting on the uniform on Friday night felt very different than wearing your practice uniform Monday through Thursday. And so I now use that as a way to motivate myself, because if I'm going to stand in front of an audience and they've given me their time and that organization has paid me, they should get something excellent in return for that. And if I feel excellent about myself, I'm going to do a better job conveying a message that can help them professionally and personally.
Yeah. Awesome. I totally agree with that. I see that. That's why I dress up. Mentally, I want to bring my A game every single day. So that's really, really important for me. So when you talk, in sales, right, about influencing people, though, you mentioned that there's two things here, and I think this is interesting. One is to find similarities, which I totally get, right? I think that's really important. We need to find out what's in common, right? Maybe we both played football. We both, went to Ohio State, whatever those things are. That's important. But then this, and this one was interesting to me. I wrote this down. Find things that you can genuinely praise and compliment them on. Mm-hmm. Now, while I think that seems obvious, I want you to talk about why it's so important to be genuine in that and not just some random stupid compliment.
Okay. Well, because your genuineness, when you are truly looking for something that you can compliment somebody on, what you're actually doing is not just making that person feel good and like you, you are convincing yourself that that's actually a good person. When I look for the good in somebody and I begin to focus on that, all of a sudden I think more highly of them. And what they end up sensing is, Brian really likes me. Brian really cares for me. And that's what opens them up. It's not just, oh, I like Brian. It's, I recognize that he has my best interest at heart. And the other thing that's really important about this too, when it comes to manipulation, if I am focused on what we have in common and what I can compliment you on, and I truly come to start liking you, Phil, well, I would never manipulate my friends. And that is the difference maker. Now nobody has to worry about manipulation. I truly like you. I want the best for you. You sense that you are far more open to what I might suggest. It becomes a win for everybody.
Awesome. I really dig that. So folks, if you're listening, we're about halfway through with Brian Ahearn, the author of the great book, Influence People. It's fantastic. I read it. I got it, as I mentioned at the beginning, from as a result of Dory Clark mentioning on Twitter, talk about influence, right? Dory just tweeted about it, and immediately I went and purchased the book and followed Brian and asked him to be on the show. So really strong example of influence. And when we talk about that, let's talk about social media, Brian, because so many of us are using social. And I love what you said. You said that Facebook doesn't change anyone's opinion. So why is that?
I think the reason that Facebook doesn't really change an opinion is because if you and I differ on a subject and I put something out on that and you come back with your viewpoint, it's not very likely that I'm going to say, Phil, that's a great point. I've never thought of that. I'm probably going to come right back with why I believe what I believe. And you're going to come back. It's like two people when they're pushing hands, right? You naturally push back. And what I have seen in my 10 plus years on social media is when people make that public commitment about what they believe, they are only digging their heels in further. And so you just begin to get this tug of war. I have yet to see somebody say, you've brought up some really good points, and I think that might change my opinion. But if we had a genuine conversation over a beer or coffee or something like that, where we were dialoguing, I believe in that realm, there is an opportunity for change.
Yeah, I completely agree. I refuse to post about politics on social media, not because I'm not passionate about making the world a better place, but because I don't see people's opinions change. In fact, to your point, I often see just the opposite, regardless of whether we post something from the right or the left or whatever, because people have their confirmation bias. That's what they love. And then from there, then they dig in their heels and they get even more rabid about their beliefs.
Exactly. And so I try to use social media. Like my Facebook is, if you and I sat down and had a beer or coffee or something like that, how I joke, the things that I talk about, my family, it would be like that. LinkedIn is much more professional. It's mostly business driven. And then Twitter can be a little bit of a mix. I use that more just to kind of get the word out to followers. But there's a distinct difference between my Facebook and my LinkedIn.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel the same way. I'm much more personal on Facebook, much more professional on LinkedIn, and definitely a blend in the middle on Twitter. And one of the things that you talk about in the book is about Twitter. And you actually talked about, also talked about Chris Brogan, who's been a guest on the show as well. But let's talk about Twitter and how the comparison trap there of I've got 2,000 followers and I only follow 138, how that feels so awkward as opposed to being nearly the same.
Well, when I first got onto social media, and in particular Twitter, it was still fairly new, and I was geeky enough to read a book about it. At least my wife and daughter would say I was geeky enough to do that. But I wanted to try to figure this thing out. I didn't find it, for me personally, as engaging as LinkedIn and Facebook. But what was really clear early on, if somebody had a lot of followers, that's the principle of consensus, right? We would look at that and go, wow, if that person has a lot of followers, they're probably worth following. It's like seeing the long line at the restaurant. Oh, they must have good food. If somebody didn't have very many followers, you're like, what's wrong with them? I mean, if they really are an expert, why don't they have more people following them? And all of a sudden, people would kind of move away. It's just hardwired into us to be in tune with what other people are doing, particularly those who are like us. And so it's really, you have to pay attention to your follower, how many you're following and how many are following you. If that ratio gets way out of whack, you're just clicking and following everybody, and all of a sudden you're following a couple thousand people, but only 100 have followed you. People are going to just say, why would I want to follow somebody who has 100 followers? They're just following everybody else. And so there's a strategy to how you would want to use your social influence to increase your social influence.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's also, I think, why some people buy followers to make it look like they're more influential. And then we see things like people that have a ton of followers that get absolutely zero engagement. So that disconnect, right? That's the principle, I would say, of inconsistency. People that look like they're influential, look like they have influence, and then totally do not.
Well, I would make that akin to somebody who doesn't dress the part, but dresses in a way to fool you. So there's a chapter in the book on an individual named Marc Dreier. And Marc Dreier, when he was interviewed on 60 Minutes, said, in terms of his condo, which was several $1 million, and his yacht, which was several $1 million, he said, if you were going to interact with people who were millionaires and try to get their money, you had to look the part. So he was faking it until he could make it. And I'm not an advocate of that at all, because it was only done to deceive people.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. And a great lesson there. Don't attempt to deceive or manipulate. Instead, seek to influence. I think that's a good lesson for us, Brian. So let's take this home, right? So let's talk about influencing ourselves as we kind of wrap this up here, because I thought that was really a great piece of the book. It was near the end. You talked about how we need to use the PAVE acronym in order to have better resolutions. So talk us through that PAVE model and how we can use that to really achieve what we want to achieve for influencing ourselves.
Okay. So the principle of consistency tells us that human beings, we feel this internal psychological pressure to be consistent in what we say and what we do. And we also feel an external social pressure. We just look better to other people when we keep our word. But that internal driver is the bigger one. We just feel better when we follow through and do what we say. Now, if we don't take that step and make a public acknowledgement of maybe what we want to do, get in shape, lose weight, earn more money, something like that, well, then it just stays inside of us. And there are studies that show that when you don't make a public commitment, your odds of achieving your goal are significantly less. In fact, in some of the studies, it's no better than not even making a goal. So PAVE stands for public, active, voluntary, and effort. When you make something public, all of a sudden you're on the line. The more active you are, the more invested you become in it, the more likely you are to ultimately follow through. The V is voluntary. This has to be your goal, not somebody else's goal for you. Because when somebody imposes a goal on you, you'll never own it in the same way as if you come up with it yourself. And finally, the E is the effort. The more effort you have to expend, the more likely you are to follow through. Dan Ariely highlighted this in what he called the IKEA effect. That people would buy furniture from IKEA that is, quite frankly, probably not as nice as other furniture they could buy, but people tend to love it because when you get it home, you got to put it together. And it's not like you got a hammer and saw or anything, but you have to work to put it together. And it's that old thing. Phil, did your mom or dad ever tell you when you were a kid, save your money and buy it yourself? You will appreciate it more?
Absolutely. All the time.
And we did, because if God forbid, whatever we bought, if we lost it or it broke or something happened to it, we felt way worse than something that was just given to us. And that's really what we're talking about here. The more effort you put into something, the more you own it, the more you want to see it come to fruition. So I think if people stop and think about that acronym, what is my goal? I want to make it public. I need to then take some active steps to get me going. It has to be voluntary. It has to be mine. And the more effort I can put forth, those will up the odds that you will personally follow through and do what it is that you want to do, your goal.
Wow, that's fantastic. So that's public, active, voluntary, and effort. And that reminds me of many years ago, I worked for a gentleman by the name of Dick Strawn. And Dick was all about thinking like an owner. And those 4 words that you talked about, right? It was voluntary to do that. We all committed to it together. It needed effort and it needed to be active, something that we did. I think that was the secret. And though Dick didn't know that acronym, I can tell you that was really helpful, Brian. That's really good.
Great. I like acronyms because they can end up being very easy to remember. When I'm doing a workshop, what I talk about is you want to pave the way to success. And I'll have a picture of a paver up there, but obviously, it drives home the picture, the word, and then the concept, and it's more likely for people to remember it. And my job is to help them understand these concepts and understand them for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, mnemonics work, right? That's why we do those, because anything that helps us remember, especially you picture, you anchor that, you anchor the word,
yep.
You anchor each piece. I mean, that just makes so much sense. So folks, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book yet, it just came out last week, actually. It's called Influence People. It's Brian Ahearn. Fantastic book. I strongly encourage you do 2 things. 1, buy the book and read it. And then, and Brian suggests this in the book too, and I love this, take a chapter and put it into play. Pave the way to your success, just like Brian told us how we can. So Brian, last words here. Any last thoughts on influence maybe that you didn't get to, or an encouragement for people that are getting started on the influence journey?
Influence is a skill like any other skill. It will feel weird or awkward at first because you'll think, well, that's not how I talk, or that's not what I do. And we're not asking you to fake something, but I know whenever you're learning a skill, for example, my wife, she's a really good golfer, but when she takes a lesson, sometimes she doesn't hit the ball as well until she gets in the groove of what she's supposed to do. It may feel awkward, but it's a skill. Keep at it. Take this stuff, weave it into your own words and personal application, and all of a sudden it becomes part of who you are. And you'll know that when people jokingly tell you, I know what you're doing. And sometimes I'd say, tell me. And they would point out some things that truthfully I hadn't consciously thought of, but it was such a part of me that's just how I ended up communicating. And I was like, wow, that's really good. So stick with it. And it's something that you have to continue to learn, practice, and grow at.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Fantastic. So, Brian, last question for you here, sir, as we wrap this up about Influence People, Brian Ahearn's new book. Fantastic stuff. If people want to connect with you more, if they want to get to know more about your work, obviously they should go to Amazon or wherever great books are sold and get a copy. But what else can they do to get more connected with you and get some more of your greatness?
Okay. Well, first of all, if they go out to my website, which is influencepeople.biz, out there you'll find tons of resources. I've been blogging weekly for more than 10 years. You can sign up for the blog every Tuesday morning. You would get that in an email format. I've got lots of videos. I've been guests on dozens of podcasts. I always post those out there. So there's lots and lots of resources on the website. Obviously, connect with me on LinkedIn. Now, if you're listening to this and you reach out to connect to me and you don't put in a note about having heard me on the show, expect that you will get a reply back that will say, thanks for reaching out to connect. How'd you come across my profile? And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, I want to understand where people are coming and why they're connecting. And 2, it opens up the door to be social, because I've literally had people say, well, actually, I just clicked on the connect link. I hope that's okay. And I'll reply back and say, hey, it's your lucky day. And then we'll get a little banter going. But now we get to the social part of social media. And you never know where that's going to go. So expect that you'll hear from me if you don't give me that reason why you're reaching out to connect.
Awesome. 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 That's super easy to do. Brian Ahearn, that's Ahearn. The book, folks, is Influence People. You go to influencepeople.biz. You can check them out and learn all about how to influence people ethically, which I think is super great. So Brian, thanks so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. It was really good.
Thank you for having me on. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.